The views and opinions expressed on Reasonably Speaking are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position of the American Law Institute or the speakers' organizations. The content presented in this broadcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. Please be advised that episodes of Reasonably Speaking explore complex and often sensitive legal topics and may contain mature content.
Welcome to Reasonably Speaking. The following is part one of a two-part episode on race and policing. I had the pleasure of sitting down with three people who are working on the front lines with police officers, community leaders, and national organizations. First, I met together with Sherrilyn Ifill and Barry Friedman. Sherrilyn Ifill is the 7th president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. After graduating law school, Sherrilyn served first as a fellow at the American Civil Liberties Union and then for 5 years as an assistant counsel in the Legal Defense Fund's New York office, where she litigated voting rights cases. A critically acclaimed author, her book, On the Courthouse Lawn, Confronting the Legacy of Lynching in the 21st Century, reflects her lifelong engagement in and analysis of issues of race and American public life. Barry Friedman is a professor at New York University School of Law and director of NYU's Policing Project, devoted to helping bring principles of democratic governance and data-driven best practices to policing. Barry is one of the country's leading authorities on constitutional law, criminal procedure, and the federal courts. He is the author of the book Unwarranted: Policing Without Permission. He writes extensively about police regulation, constitutional law and theory, federal jurisdiction, and judicial behavior. Then in a separate interview, I sat down with John Malcolm of the Heritage Foundation. John Malcolm oversees the Heritage Foundation's work to increase the understanding of the Constitution and the rule of law. John is also chairman of the Criminal Law Practice Group of the Federalist Society and chairman of the board of directors for Boys Town, Washington, D.C. John has broad experience in both the public and private sectors. Previously, he was general counsel at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, the Worldwide Anti-Piracy Director for the Motion Picture Association of America, a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Department of Justice, and an Assistant U.S. Attorney in Atlanta. In part one, we begin by exploring the history of race in America and race in policing with Sherrilyn and Barry. We're here to talk about race and policing, but I'm wondering if you'd like to take a step back and talk more broadly about the history of race in this country.
Well, let me limit it to race and policing, actually, because that's a good example of the lived reality, of African Americans in relation to government, in relation to government and state power, and the broader recognition within the majority white community of what that reality is. And it's really important because I'm not sure that we have cause to celebrate yet that there's this kind of greater consciousness. I do think that this is something we have to track very closely. But, the example I give is for me, my first awareness of, police officers and issues of policing occurred for me as a kid here in New York. And when I was 10, a young man was shot by the police and killed by the police here in New York, in Queens, where I lived. And it was a big story because it was a kid. I was 10 and he was 10. The police officer killed the young man. The young man was with his father on a Saturday morning. Plainclothes police officers began to chase the father and the son and shot the son and killed him. And after they killed him, the two officers stood around and one of the officers said, we got him. That young boy and his father were actually going to do what they did on Saturday mornings, which was that they went and they collected scrap metal and they went to a kind of junkyard to get some cash for the scrap metal that they created. The police officers contended that they thought these were robbery suspects. Again, the boy was 8 years old. The officer, all I could remember about this story was that the officer's name was Shay and that he was acquitted. And I could remember what the front page of the Daily News looked like. I could remember the conversations at the bus stop with the parents about, this incident that happened. There actually was unrest. People seem to forget this, with fires and cars burning. I mean, this was a real issue that happened in Queens, and this had to be in 1972 or 3. And I'd actually almost forgotten about that as a formative experience, but I can tell you it was a formative experience in terms of how I understood what it might mean to encounter a police officer and so forth. And when after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, I had a pre-scheduled conversation with a radio show, and on that radio show, I began talking. It just suddenly came to me. I hadn't planned it at all, but I remembered this case, and I started talking about it. By the time I got back to my hotel room, someone had tweeted at me, I found the case, and they linked to the story in the paper, and because I said I couldn't remember the name of the boy. His name was Clifford Glover, and yes, the officer's name was Shay. I don't know why I still remembered that, but I did remember that, and it was exactly as I remembered it. So what do you do with that consciousness, with that? It wasn't because I had had a violent encounter with police officers, but because this moved me, because this little boy was the same age that I was, and it was disorienting to imagine that this could happen to somebody. So just understanding what our segregated experiences are like in this country lies at the bottom of that lack of broader understanding that you're talking about. If we fast forward into the last few years, I suspect that for many people, seeing Eric Garner choked to death on their television screens or on their iPhones is for some people the first time they've even seen anybody killed. Maybe the first time they saw someone killed, or the second time was when they saw Walter Scott running through that park and shot in the back in North Charleston. And it took that. It took having to see it with your own eyes for many white people to even believe that there was this phenomenon of unconstitutional policing, of police killing unarmed African Americans, and so forth. I always say I want to get to the place where Black people will just be believed, that you don't have to see it yourself, because there's all kinds of things that happen in our criminal justice system that we don't see. If someone tells me there was an armed robbery at a bank, I don't have to actually see it with my own eyes to believe it. So I'm not sure we're there yet, but I also know we can't unsee what we've seen. And so despite all the questions about whether policing reform will happen and whether we're, turning back the clock from some of the progress that was made in this conversation, I'm a firm believer in the same way that I could not get the memory of Officer Shea and the front page of that Daily News sitting on my parents' coffee table out of my head 40 years later. I don't think people will unsee Eric Garner. I don't think people will unsee Walter Scott. And that means that we're being fundamentally reshaped in some way in our understanding about what we should permit and what we should not permit in terms of state power and their encounters with ordinary people.
So I'm going to drop back and talk sort of more historically, but I think Sherrilyn's point about lived experience, and I said before we started today, the history goes all the way up to yesterday. And a couple weeks ago, the NYPD and Open Society Foundations and the Policing Project co-hosted a sort of closed-door session with the department heads in New York about racial disparities in policing. And Patrick Gaspard, who's the head of OSF, told this unbelievably affecting story about when he was 12 years old, my son's 11, and he was, being harassed by kids trying to go to the Catholic school that he went to. And the police stopped him, and they regularly harassed these African-American kids coming to this Catholic school in a different neighborhood, and asked him to prove that he went to that school. So he pulled out his bus pass. Mm-hmm. And the police said, "You don't live here," and tore up his bus pass. And this kid, I could practically burst into tears here, this kid walks 4 miles home by himself. And I think, I don't know that my son could pull that off. Mm-hmm. And so, that's not a shooting, but the inhumanity of that, the disdain for another human being, a kid, is incredibly powerful. And I think that I want to back it up historically because, David Kennedy, who's done a tremendous amount of work around gang violence, who's at John Jay, I was at a gathering with him once, and somebody was asking if people could attach a narrative to stop and frisk. And he said, well, the people who are being subjected to it in communities of color don't need you to construct a narrative for them. They have one that starts with slavery being written into the Constitution. It runs through the Civil War and Reconstruction, but then to redemption, this horrific period in history where the Union removes its troops from the South and racial hatred runs wild in ways that are too horrific to contemplate, up through the early part of the last century and Jim Crow and into the 1960s, and then right up into the events that Sherrilyn's touching on. And so there's a very easily constructed narrative that race and policing have been bound up in very troubling ways. And a recent president of the American Association of Chiefs of Police, Terry Cunningham, had the courage to stand up in front of those chiefs and recognize this history. And I think it's very, very difficult for us to make any progress on this issue unless and until we're all willing to understand the context in which it arises. It's not a today phenomenon.
And think about how much we allow people who are in extraordinary positions of power and influence to not know the history, right? I mean, it's just, if we just even think about, to deny it, to not know it. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to kind of say, well, I don't agree with the motivations for that, or I don't think it was exactly that way. But they don't know about slave patrols, and they don't know about the black codes. They don't know about the development of our criminal justice system and the policing of black men in particular as a form of social control and as a form of economic empowerment for white interests. They don't know that history. So when you say it, it's like I just said it, and I'm sure somebody listening will think, well, that just sounds outrageous. This is one of those crazy lefty people who's just, But it's because you don't know, and because we allow people to be professors of American history and to be influential leaders, all around in law enforcement and in the Attorney General's office and all of the places that set policy and have tremendous control. And on the bench, we allow people to run a bench, in which they have criminal cases every day, and they don't know this history. So there is a kind of cavalier way in which there is a denial of the significance of that history to the present moment. And there's no other place where we do that. We love history. We love talking about the founders and the framers and the Second Amendment and originalism. And we love talking about these deep roots of our founding instruments. And yet when it comes to this history, it's kind of like optional. Maybe you know about it, maybe you don't. If you know about it, don't talk about it too much, or people will decide that you're kind of, harping on something that is unpleasant and uncomfortable. But when Barry just says, talks about slavery, and look, the idea that you could write into your founding document that a set of people are constituted by a fraction for purposes of your governance, 3/5 of a person, you think you can unembed that out of the national psyche easily?
Well, even the 3/5, to pivot to the Constitution, right? Because that's absolutely right. But would have been lower than 3/5, except that there was an economic argument and a political power argument on behalf of the South that they wanted that for their ownership of slaves, of people. And
that was a conversation. Yes. There was a negotiation about what fraction of a person black people would be. And that's in your founding document. And it doesn't come out, right? It's not really changed until we fight a terrible civil war at the cost of 600,000 lives and amend the Constitution with 3 amendments to the Constitution and have federal troops occupying part of the country. Think about what it took. And that's just to legally transform that. So if you don't understand the significance of that and don't understand how that becomes then embedded into the national psyche in ways that are going to show up in all kinds of areas of state control and power, then how are you in fact expert? How can you lead? How can you develop sound policy in this area? And certainly, what right have you to dismiss those who do want to engage these important issues?
I continued the conversation about implicit bias with John, who concurred that racism is embedded throughout more than police departments.
Well, the whole issue of race and police forces is politically fraught with peril and a deep question. I will acknowledge that there are pockets of society that are they're not. There's no implicit bias. There is express explicit bias, and they are inveterate racists. And all professions, including, I'm sure, police forces, have these miscreants in their midst who are just out and out racists and terrible people. And I also don't deny at least the possibility of implicit bias. It's hard, of course, to measure something that isn't on the surface, and we all have our biases. You can have a bias against liberals, redheads, Asians, African Americans. People have their biases, and how well they are able to overcome them, or how aware they are that they exist, is a difficult question to probe. The reason that I say that I don't think that there is systemic racism among police forces is several. One is by the time, there are millions, probably tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of interactions between police officers and civilians over the course of a year. The overwhelming majority of those actual person-to-person contacts are handled perfectly appropriately, do not involve any racial element or any other element of inappropriate behavior. At upper echelons of police forces, there is a growing diversity. People may be happy with where things are, unhappy with where things are, thinking that there needs to be more diverse police forces, and there certainly are going to be some police forces that ought to be more diverse. But there is an awareness of this issue, and upper echelons of police management are increasingly diverse. And most importantly, they know they have a problem, right? No one is sticking their head in the sand about any of this. They will be the first to say, for instance, that if you go back to, say, the Jim Crow era, that there were racist laws, and they were the ones who were charged with enforcing those racist laws. They, I'm sure, have images of Bull Connor and police dogs in their mind. They know that things like Rodney King beating happen, right? So they are aware that in terms of their history, they have a real problem. A lot of and this has caused them tangible problems. They are having trouble recruiting people to become police officers, because particularly in communities of color, because being a police officer is not considered a desirable profession because of the tensions that exist. I'll add one other thing, which is a lot of the police officers whom they are able to recruit are now millennials. Millennials are very, very aware of this, past history and all of these allegations of racism. They don't see themselves as racist, and they want to see themselves, as all millennials do, including my children, as part of a solution and not part of a problem. So there is an awareness of this history and the reality that they face, and they are very keen. I have talked to many, many police officers and have seen this in their eyes and heard this in their voices. They want to change this dialogue, and they are very frustrated because they think that there is a lack of understanding about how police work actually gets done, and their lives are on the line.
Let's return to the conversation with Barry and Sherrilyn. While exploring the topic of implicit bias and community fear, Barry raised a concept that was new to me: the idea that we could or should have a society without police.
And I'm going to pivot in perhaps an unusual direction from that, but Sherrilyn a couple of times has said state power, and that's the right thing to think about. So the tragedy of the failure to remember our history is that it pays off today or is cashed out today in conversations about the abolition movement around policing. And I confess the first time somebody suggested to me that we should abolish the police, a very prominent person, I almost fell off my chair. But I get it, and everybody should get it, because it takes a failure of state obligations that is pretty profound for people to then decide that they would be better off without the police. And yet it is a perfectly rational response in neighborhoods that up to the present feel that net they are losing out from policing rather than benefiting from it. And we are never going to get ourselves ever into a place where policing are part of our lives and part of our communities in a healthy way until we recognize the racial history and come to grips with it and then start to actually do very tangible things about it to move forward.
This is one of the reasons why I really try, when I talk about reform, to talk more about public safety than to talk about policing. I do think that at least most of the folks that I encounter in the communities of people that I represent are not actually abolitionists. They don't want no police because they don't know what the choices are, and they are very often living in communities where there is tremendous violent crime and where they have real concerns about public safety. So I think it's about redefining public safety, first of all, and redefining the role of the police in a larger public safety apparatus. Because I think there are circumstances in which people would want to call the police, circumstances involving threats of very serious violent crime and so forth. But I think what has happened is that we have allowed the police to take over the management of an array of problems in the community that actually don't require someone showing up on the scene with a loaded weapon, right? So if you had in the community a mental health corps, by corps I mean CORPS, right? A set of social service workers who, when your son or daughter was having a schizophrenic episode or was having some other mental health breakdown, that was who you called. And that team came and they were trained and equipped in how to engage in volatile encounters with mentally ill people or with people suffering from certain kinds of emotional distressing circumstances. That might be one thing, right? That you wouldn't call the police for that. Most people wouldn't call the police on their kids unless their kids were being really violent in a way they felt they couldn't manage.
When I met with John, we spoke at length about the need for strong and diverse training programs for police and whether or not there is a better option for a first responder in certain instances.
To Sherrilyn's point, that a police officer showing up somewhere, whether it's confronting a homeless person or going into a home where somebody is acting out, domestic violence situation, potentially violent, whether that can escalate a situation, it can. It all depends. A lot of this, police officers now, and I think they realize this, need specialized training in dealing with the mentally ill and in de-escalating what are very, very tense situations. As with all training, some police officers are adequately trained, some of them are not. So if her point is you have a disturbed person, you're in a situation, that situation can go one of two ways. It can either escalate into a violent confrontation in which somebody gets hurt, most likely the mentally disturbed person who is acting out, or whether it can de-escalate and calm down and deal with the situation in an appropriate, humane way in which nobody gets hurt. That to me is not a question about whether it's a police officer who does it versus a social worker who does it. To me, that is a question of, has this person been adequately trained about what to do in this sort of situation in order to act appropriately, in order to de-escalate the situation? Sometimes, by the way, that will involve stepping back and remaining calm, and in a calm way trying to give the person who is mentally disturbed a voice to explain what it is that's going on that's caused him or her to act out in this sort of way. Sometimes it will involve using a commanding voice that will get somebody who has a weapon to stop what they're doing, drop the weapon, and end a situation. These are individual situations that are all very tense, and there's no cookie-cutter solution. So her point is, if her point is, will there be occasions when a social worker will be better to de-escalate a situation than a police officer? Absolutely, I'm sure that's correct. But one, there aren't that many social workers who are going to be responding to these calls. And in addition to that, police officers, if they're adequately trained, should be able to handle the situation. But that's a big if, because training is expensive. This is sort of a new phenomenon. And in big cities, they are probably starting to get adequate training. Whether they're getting adequate training in rural areas and suburban areas, anybody's guess. But the cross section between dealing with the mentally ill, some of whom can be quite violent, and law enforcement officers. I mean, they are, for all of these situations, for better or ill, our first responders. And so they are the ones on the scenes when mentally ill people are acting out. And every time a mentally ill person is acting out, the situation has the potential to end very badly.
Let's return now to Sherrilyn and Barry.
And so, but the problem is we don't have that option. We don't have that alternative for people. That if young people are outside and they're making noise late and you told them go in and they've cussed you out and they're banging on cars, we don't have a youth corps, CORPS. We don't have a set of people trained in how to engage in encounters with young people to provide the services they need to be able to communicate in ways that are effective. And so what do people do? They look out their window, they talk to those kids twice and they won't do it, and so they call the police. So I even think that there's a stage before we get to this conversation about abolition. Abolition reflects the lack of choices that we're presenting people with. And that in fact, there are an array of choices that one could imagine public safety, a public safety apparatus that was really created and premised on the needs of the community around public safety, and would then include as part of that, but a small part of that, the police. It wouldn't be the whole thing. Right now, policing is the whole kit and caboodle, and I think that's the problem.
This is a little bit remarkable for me. I stand corrected. I think Sherrilyn's right to talk about public safety. Sherrilyn, you can't know this, but I'm working on an article, working on 2 articles right now, one of which is called Reimagining Public Safety, and we could be writing it together because it is exactly this argument. And I asked this question at that gathering I talked about, which is, one question you want to ask is, why are the police here? What has historically brought this to be a place where there's intense police activity? But then the next important question is, why are the police here? Why? And you hear the police all the time say, we're dealing with all these problems we shouldn't have to. And historically, that's actually not necessarily right. In the 1800s, when we first had police departments, very often that was where the folks who were homeless, who had problems with alcohol, ended up spending the nights. We've lost that part of our history also. But there's this really good question: why our first response is policing? And I often say it's because police are first responders, but that doesn't mean they're the right responders. And so the question is, when it's substance abuse, when it's homelessness, when it's mental illness, when it's people complaining about the noise, why doesn't a mediator show up? Somebody with social services help? And it may be, I want to be sane and level-headed about this. It may be that in some of those situations, the capacity for force has to be on the outskirts in case things go horribly bad.
That's right.
But it shouldn't be...
It's not first.
Right. And our first societal response shouldn't be the person... Think about how police come equipped, dressed, right? We've called the person with handcuffs and a gun the law enforced. That's our... Other than the fact that we've historically done this in path-dependent ways, we would never think it was a sane way to deal with the problems.
That's exactly right.
We've been talking about the times when somebody has called the police to respond to a situation. Let's turn our attention to those times when police operate in a proactive space when nobody has called them.
Well, there's a lot to say there. Obviously, stop and frisk speaks for itself, and we litigated one of the public housing stop and frisk cases in which, adheres the relationship between law enforcement and politics. And this is also the piece that has to be talked about, because there are political interests that are involved in what stats you reveal about your town, right? What your arrest statistics are, what your crime statistics are, how people feel about the city. If you've been around New York, that's a big deal, is whether people feel like the city is safe or not. And there's a lot of political and law enforcement capital that goes into creating an atmosphere that makes people feel a certain way about being in New York. And you could say this for any major city, particularly any major city that relies in some measure on tourism as part of its economic infrastructure. So that we don't talk about that very much. I'm actually quite sympathetic to police departments on in this way, because very often they are responding to a political imperative. It's not that Ray Kelly's just doing stop and frisk on his own. He's doing it in concert and very much supported by Mayor Bloomberg, who has a vision of what, the city should feel like and look like. And the same is true for Rudy Giuliani. And the same was true in Baltimore through its many police commissioners as well. So the police are actually, in that circumstance, actually in some ways kind of caught because they are executing a plan that is very much in some ways created or supported or pushed by the political leaders in a community who want a certain kind of outcome and want to be able to say something about that community. But certainly you raised the issue of kind of surveillance. Now that we're now not even just talking about the police officer who's walking on the street and stopping every young kid and going through their pockets and doing all the terrible stuff that we knew about stop and frisk. But when we're talking about something like the NYPD's gang database that we actually know very little about in terms of how you get in it. We know something about, the colors you wear, the bodega that you shop at, and so forth. But there's no real due process for how you can petition to get out of the database if you're wrongly included in the database. It's all kind of shrouded and behind a wall. And the stigma of being on this database, even if you then are arrested, is that the DA then knows that you were in a gang database. That's relevant, right, to your sentencing, to whether you're going to get bail. And so we may be branding young people. And we had a hearing. We'd asked for a hearing of for the NYPD to talk about this gang database because we're trying to learn more about it. We filed a FOIA request. We haven't gotten the information. We filed a lawsuit after we didn't get the FOIA information to try to learn more about the gang database. But what we do know, what is undisputed, is that it is somewhere between 98 and 99% people of color, young people of color. The youngest person in the gang database, as far as we can tell, is 13. So we're talking about branding thousands of young people in our city, young people of color in our city in this way. And I think most people who live in New York know that if, the definition of gang is about, is essentially people who are engaged in concerted action intending to engage in criminal conduct or suspected of engaging in political criminal conduct, that young people, 98 to 99% African American, Latino, are not the only people who would fit that description. And so it's quite interesting that that's the database, right? Because there are all kinds of people engaged in concerted activity, concerted criminal activity in New York. So that's a very passive, right? Nobody called anybody. Right? It's just a tool with a set of criteria that are kind of opaque. And this is, I think we're entering a stage of something really quite frightening. Not that the police haven't always, had books of mugshots and so forth, but this is quite alarming because you wouldn't know you were in the gang database. You'd just be in there.
So the problem, in a sense, is that we don't and never have taken a regulatory approach to policing. So our theory of government in the United States is that we regulate the government. Madison said this, and it's always been true, which is that we first need a government to sort of control society, but then we have to regulate government itself to not infringe on our rights. And this is a widely held notion. It's fundamental, including, deeply into conservative movements. But we've never looked at policing that way. And so we always look to policing to be regulated through courts and warrants and probable cause, which doesn't fit the kinds of things that Sherrilyn's talking about, where you actually need transparency, you need a set of rules that everybody can see and understand, we need to agree on the rules, and that's lacking. And so, I'll just throw this out there, which is, I'm not persuaded, whatever the purposes of the NYPD's gang database or upcoming facial recognition systems or automatic license plate reader systems or any of these surveillance techniques that are going, it's astonishing how far they've already gone and are going to go much, much further, that any of them would be less effective and less useful tools if we regulated them up front in ways that we tried to care about our civil liberties, about racial injustice. I just don't buy it. And the story you get all the time is, well, we can't police effectively if everybody knows what we're doing. And there are some tiny, I don't think anybody really thinks that we should have public and need to have public what the exact protocols are for dealing with an active shooter at a school. Though it might even be that if we knew about it, we can improve on those tactics, because very often, secrecy hides incompetence. But I just don't buy at any level that if we took Sherrilyn's example and said, let's do it transparently, let's ask what we're doing, why we're doing it, does it make sense, who's in, what are the racial disparities, is there a place where we could find that this was acceptable for everybody, that we wouldn't make progress and not hinder anything that anybody in law enforcement thinks they want to achieve. And so I think we just go completely off the rails by thinking that we have to do things in secret. Secrecy breeds mistrust, it breeds violations of civil liberties, it breeds racism, and that, we're never going to have legitimacy and trust around policing until we just turn on the lights.
That's a really great way to just even think about this and talk about this. Which is very pragmatic in some ways. Where's the evidence that all this secrecy actually is producing the result that law enforcement very often claims comes from them being able to do things behind the veil? And I think you're absolutely right. It also, the stakes are so high. I mean, the idea that we've put all our eggs in the regulation after it happens basket for people who have a gun and a taser and a nightstick and are authorized to kill in the name of the state, right? That all of our regulatory work goes on the back end, right? It's to find out should you have gotten that warrant? And, did you engage in stop and frisk? And was it racial? But it's all on the back end. And there's very little on the front end, as Barry has been talking about for some time, that actually is a code that describes how you should behave. Barry and I are lawyers, right? It's not like after you become a lawyer, then you get the code, right? Like you have to take professional responsibility in law school. Like you're clued into the fact that there are going to be rules to this thing that you're about to engage in, right? And these are going to be the rules that govern your conduct. And those rules are set forth, and anybody can find them. You can find the model code of judicial conduct if you want to be a judge, right? It's not ex post facto, they exist. Right. And yet, as Barry has talked about for some time, there's no code, there's no infrastructure of responsibilities and ethical underpinning. And these are to people for whom, when they make a mistake, right, when there is incompetence, when there is racism, the result can be the loss of life in the name of the state. So it's actually, the example is just so astonishing that we kind of decide, well, let's just see what happens. And we're crossing the streams now because it's crossing with the technological industry that operates by the thesis that you build it and then you work it out later and see whether it works or not, right? I was just, at the MIT lab a couple weeks ago. It's also innovative. It's also exciting. It's also like creepy as hell, right? All these amazing ideas of all these great things that you can do with very little on the front end about like whether you should do it, right? And what are the ethical implications and what are the moral implications and so forth? And how is this going to play out in, given the reality of racism and sexism and all that? And this is what I keep saying, AI is being built in our world, a world that is rife with injustice and rife with inequality, rife with racism, rife with sexism and so forth. And so you're building it into that world. The idea that you're going to build something over here and then like deposit it into that world without having considered all those things that are part of our daily life is just astonishing. But that's the theory, right? They build all these amazing things and then we just throw it out there. And now we're learning that Facebook is maybe problematic in some really important ways, right? But we're learning it after elections have been compromised and so forth. So the idea that we would take that and now cross it with the place where we are the most hands-off as it relates to state power, policing, is about as creepy as it gets. And I feel like I've seen this horror movie, and it doesn't turn out good.
This just has long struck me as insane. The part of the government to which we give the most power is the least regulated. And again, if we were thinking this up from the ground up, we'd never be where we are. And Sherrilyn's right to point to the sort of technological revolution. And if you think about what policing, and I'm deliberately using policing now instead of public safety, or law enforcement looks like now, it's not an old model where somebody's a suspect and we're going to go after them, but it's things like airport security and drunk driving roadblocks, and now we're going to do it with CCTV, and we are trying to regulate people's behavior by monitoring them. And we're doing it in profound ways, but Sherrilyn is exactly right. It is just rushing ahead. And I'm just drawing an analogy to the world that we're all living in because it, as you talked, it struck me as so apt, which is, we went through this globalizing phase, and, daisies coming out of the ground. It was all going to be wonderful, and we'd have free trade, and every ship would rise, and it would all be excellent. And we are, I think, I may be misdiagnosing this, but looking at a, right-leaning backlash to this throughout the world that is terrifying me, that I think about things that I just didn't imagine would happen in my lifetime. They were history. And it's because people didn't give enough thought to the structures and the impacts and the social costs. And now we're about to do it with technology. And so this is this is exactly the metaphor. It's Brave New World, which is, we're going to steam ahead with all this stuff. And, those of us who are paying attention know full well it's going to have extraordinary racial effects. Glad to say more about that. It's going to have unbelievable incursions to our privacy. We've all seen those dystopian movies, whether it's Minority Report or something else. And there is possibility and hope to this technology. I am not one of those people that says, don't use the technology. I mean, you can have less of an impact and less of a footprint if you use the technology properly, but misused, it's going to cause its own backlash that I can't even imagine.
I hope that maybe you can say something more about what could be the positive uses, because I do try to think about that. What if we could harness this energy and use it for good? But I do think we have to spend a lot of time dealing with what we can already see are the potentially very devastating and bad consequences. The words predictive policing scare the hell out of me. The use of risk assessments in prison, the use of algorithms in all kinds of ways. I mean, this is again what I mean about pretending as though these things exist outside of our world. It's like whatever you put into it is what's going to come out of it. And you're not required to create a model that demonstrates that you're not putting into it the same kinds of biases that we use all the time in our criminal justice system. And so I'm really curious about, have there been any technological innovations that when you looked at that, you thought, wow, it'd be great if we used that to X, right, in a way that would be positive and ameliorate some of the problems that we see in law enforcement?
Yeah, so just to give one example, and it's interesting to me because we live in this funny space where we see all of the very concerning downsides while there are wide swaths of society, as I'm sure you're aware, that are gaga about the possibilities. And so, but one of the places where I think there's hope to use data in a helpful way is work that, for example, Ann Milgram or other folks are doing around the relationship between public health data and law enforcement data, and an awareness of how there are a set of very chronic incidents in society that we repeatedly deal with by using law enforcement, which is nuts because you're not going to fix substance abuse and homelessness and mental illness with law enforcement. But people that are often deemed frequent flyers, which is a sad way to think about how we're thinking about those people, will be arrested 40 times. And to the extent that we can use data and algorithmic searching and figure out where there are trouble spots in society where we could devote social resources and try to actually fix social problems, is a happy story.
Thank you for listening to Race and Policing Part 1, History, Training Programs, and Police as First Responders on Reasonably Speaking. I hope you'll join us for Part 2 of this episode when Sherrilyn, Barry, John, and I discuss more about the use of data and predictive policing, funding priorities, and working together toward a solution.
Thank you for tuning in to Reasonably Speaking. Visit ALI.org to learn more about this important topic and our speakers. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Reasonably Speaking is produced by the American Law Institute with audio engineering by Kathleen Morton and digital editing by Kristen Evans. Podcast episodes are moderated by Jennifer Marinigo, and I'm Sean Kellum.